I recall her confiding to her father about the necessity of my presence during that crucial moment. 7 identities, 7 deep-seated scars. And Whitney Houston elected to remember them through a lens of profound bitterness. Not all past loves deserve tribute, especially those kept hidden, suffocating in the dark, never allowed to live beneath the glare of fame. In a world of choreographed smiles and polished perfection, Whitney once loved in silence. She longed to be her truest self, but then, with her own trembling hands, she sealed shut every door behind which 7 women once stood. One of them, Robin Crawford, was a known confidant. The other 6, flickers in the shadows, secret glances, encounters never spoken of, scars never allowed to heal. Some were so well known it's nearly impossible to believe they brushed against Whitney's world. Some awakened the urge to love, but names were never spoken. And some, Whitney herself confessed, she grew to despise. Behind the legend of the diva, hidden beneath the velvet and the applause, lies a list never shown to the world until now. A blacklist of hearts, of secrets, of silenced longing. Like, comment, subscribe if you're ready to enter the side of Whitney Houston that no spotlight ever dared to touch. Not everyone survives the spotlight, not because it dazzles, but because once it fades, what's left behind is what truly terrifies. Whitney was once that figure, radiant, untouchable, a blazing force that made many believe she was immune to shadow, but hidden beneath the shimmer was someone just like her, cloaked in her own brand of light, and, ironically, the one who left Whitney with her deepest heartbreak, Jodie Foster. To the world, Whitney was the diva, the icon, the unshakable star. But behind the stage curtains and beyond the flashbulbs, she was someone who moved through life by feeling guided by a heart that beat 2 melancholies deeper than any lyric could hold. In a world where sentiment was a weakness, where deeper skin tones carried burdens of being too much, Whitney's vulnerability wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. In the early 90s, hushed whispers told of a connection between Whitney and Jodie that defied labels. Not friends, not lovers. Something unnamed, elusive, a quiet rhythm between them that echoed through hotel corridors, post-award show dinners, or studio dressing rooms where no one dared to ask questions and they never volunteered answers. People say their first real, unfiltered conversation happened at Clive Davis's birthday, a night filled with music, flashing lights, and carefully managed smiles. Clive, the man who sculpted Whitney's image with precision, was also the silent warden of her legacy. But amidst the glitz, something quiet and sacred unfolded. Jad didn't see the pop phenomenon. She didn't see the awards or the headlines. She saw a woman tired, confused, hungry for something real. And Whitney, always surrounded by people who wanted a piece of her fame, was taken aback by that rare, piercing gaze. A former staff member, whose interview mysteriously vanished from the press just hours after publication, recalled, "They were more alike than they knew. Both brilliant, both broken. One guarded her private life like a fortress, heart iced over, impervious. The other, Whitney, had to perform her joy like it was her job, to sing through her own heartbreak, to dance as if nothing inside her had ever shattered." There was one moment just a few seconds on set when Whitney said, "You know, sometimes it's not about the music, not about the money, it's about a person." The crew chuckled, thinking she meant fame fatigue. But those who truly knew her knew that all her sorrow condensed into a single, unspoken name. And all eyes drifted, wordlessly, to Jodie. Whitney once confided in someone close. She didn't need Jad to go public. She didn't need grand declarations or tabloid bravery. She needed just one moment, just one where Jad would meet her gaze and say, "I won't leave you alone in this." But that moment never arrived. A childhood friend, someone who knew Whitney before the sequins and microphones, remembered. She couldn't even watch Jad's films for a while. Didn't matter what genre, she'd say, "I don't want to see that face anymore." And yet, on nights she was intoxicated, Whitney would dig out the accused DVD, sit quietly, and cry, alone. Some say Jodie did love her truly, but she couldn't let that truth breathe, not because of paparazzi, not because of press intrusion, but because she was white, and Whitney was black. And their love, in the climate of the time, wasn't just controversial, it was radioactive. It was invisible, unspoken, unbearable. Jad lived on, carrying a guilt that whispered in silence. Whitney, she chose the only peace she knew, distance. A heartbreaking rumor still circulates. They once planned to disappear, to elope to Europe, not forever, just for a while, to be ordinary, to eat breakfast without makeup, to hold hands in a crowd, to walk in the sunlight without shame. But that plan, like their bond, dissolved into myth, soft, tragic, and unforgettable. But then, everything stopped. Their quiet, fragile world shattered the moment both management teams discovered the truth. Meetings were held. Warnings were whispered. Image came first. Careers came first. Whitney was reminded of her obligations, of the fairy tale she was meant to uphold. So, she returned to the man she would later marry. And Jody. She retreated even deeper into the fortress of silence she'd spent a lifetime constructing. Years later, someone mentioned that Whitney smiled, just faintly, when she read Jod's quote in an old, almost forgotten interview. Privacy is not about hiding. It's about choosing what to share, choosing what to keep to oneself. And perhaps that's what doomed them. Not cruelty, not distance, but the simple, agonizing truth: some stories are never told because they are too precious, too painful, or too dangerous. Jod never spoke publicly, never confessed, never confirmed. Just as Whitney never wrote a song with her name on it, but if you really listened, you'd hear the sorrow. In her later years, Whitney's voice carried a new kind of ache. The lyrics no longer sounded like pleas to a general audience. They sounded like messages, private telegrams, buried in melody, sent out to someone who once had the chance to love her in the light, but did single quotes T. There was another person, another chapter, a different kind of hurt. Queen Latifah. Whitney once confessed, though not directly, that she couldn't stand Latifah's smile, not because it lacked beauty, but because, for a fleeting moment, it made her believe again, made her feel safe again. And safety, for Whitney, was rare, more fantasy than reality. People always painted Whitney as delicate, emotionally erratic. Latifah was the opposite: grounded, composed, the type of woman who, even if the entire world cracked open, would still stand with both feet firmly planted, unshaken. That's exactly why Whitney gravitated toward her. In the chaotic swirl of showbiz, she needed a rock, not a savior, not a lover, just someone who wouldn't vanish, and Latifah was that presence. But the hurt didn't come from betrayal. It came from imbalance, from Whitney opening her heart while Latifah never fully opened hers. It wasn't a gaping wound, it was a paper cut that stung every day. In the early 2000s, whispers grew louder, not of scandal, but of companionship. They were seen together often, not on red carpets, not in press tours, but in quiet places. Nevada, the Bahamas, airports and off-seasons, anonymous hotels where names weren't asked. Just two women, escaping the noise, a backstage staffer once said. Latifah would sit in the wings for hours, not saying a word, just watching Whitney perform. But her eyes, they said everything. Eyes that carried something unspoken. Maybe admiration, maybe regret, maybe the aching wish to say more, do more, but never quite knowing how. The rumor ignited after a single photo: Whitney and Latifah by a hotel pool in Miami, hair wet, hands held. No red carpets, no paparazzi. Just a candid snap from a hotel employee. Within days, the photo vanished. Some said it was quietly bought and buried to make room for Latifah's film promotion at the time. Whitney was engulfed in scandal. Latifah was rising, and Whitney never forgave that. She didn't need a public declaration. She didn't need Latifah to confirm anything. She just needed to know she wasn't alone. But when the storm came, only one of them stood to face it. The other turned away, as if none of it had ever happened. One industry insider recalled a moment backstage at an awards show. No shouting, no scene, just Whitney staring into Latifah's eyes, long and wordless. Then she turned, walked away, and that night performed It's Not Right, But It's Okay with eyes like steel. The betrayal wasn't from lies. It was from silence, the kind that grows inside disappointment. That kind when someone you trusted becomes the quietest part of the room. Later, Latifah gave an interview, saying, "Everyone has chapters they don't read aloud." It sounded philosophical, but to Whitney, it felt like a clean escape, leaving her adrift. Again, a close friend shared a haunting memory. Whitney once kept a Queen Latifah plush doll, a souvenir from Las Vegas. One night, after a few drinks, she silently cut it in half, then didn't speak for 2 days. People said Whitney was too sensitive, that Latifah had to protect her image. That showbiz friendships are fragile, but this wasn't just friendship. It was something more visible in glances, in silence after laughter, in missing photos that never returned. Whitney trusted Latifah not because she was famous, but because she was steady. That steadiness made her believe Latifah would stay, but she didn't. After that, Whitney never spoke her name again. Not out of hate, but because speaking it would mean reopening the wound. When Whitney passed, Latifah gave a tribute, beautiful, polished, restrained, but it lacked one thing: the truth. On the way to a Broadway show, Whitney once murmured to her assistant, just as the limousine pulled up. "I hate women who pretend they don't remember, when I've never forgotten." The assistant said she shivered not because the words were cruel, but because they were filled with a quiet, lifelong ache. The kind that comes not from love that was lost, but from love that was never allowed. A name? And in the third place on Whitney's unspoken list stood a name that few would expect: Kelly McGillis. Unlike the others, this wasn't a story of betrayal. There was no scandal, no confrontation, just silence. A long, unfinished reel where both women understood but neither dared to speak, and that silence is what angered Whitney the most. Kelly McGillis, the woman who lit up screens in Top Gun, spent most of her career in neutral territory, never confirming, never denying, never acknowledging anyone who had walked beside her. That is, until 2009, when she casually revealed her personal truth in a brief, delicately phrased interview. It just feels right to say it now. Whitney was at her Atlanta mansion when the interview aired. A friend present at the time recalled how she gave a faint smile and quietly said, "She says it now, huh?" Then stood up and walked away, saying nothing more. There was a rumor small whispered that they first met at a nearly empty Broadway show on a cold winter night. Kelly came alone. Whitney sat beside her assistant. No one took much notice, except for an aging photojournalist who scribbled in his notebook, "They didn't touch, but they stood closer than strangers do." The sightings didn't stop there. Quiet dinners, walks in Manhattan, a shared hotel during a film event. No photos, no recordings, just fragments from backstage staff who remembered the way they looked at each other when no one else was watching. But Whitney never mentioned Kelly again. Not in interviews, not in private conversations that were later recalled. In that silence, it meant something. What haunted Whitney wasn't Kelly's public coming out. It was that Kelly said nothing, not one word about her. Whitney didn't crave the spotlight or headlines linking their names. But she did believe that what they shared, whatever it was, had been real. And to be left out, erased from a chapter of someone else's life that she had lived so openly in her own heart, was devastating. To Whitney, that omission wasn't discretion, it was abandonment. Someone from Whitney's crew once shared a memory backstage. After a small argument, Whitney burst out in frustration. She wanted a secret, but secrets eat people like me alive. If the relationship with Kelly McGillis ever truly existed, it never became more than a flicker. According to a stylist from that era, their bond was full of subtle gestures, lingering glances, fleeting touches, affection that trembled on the edge of something more. But it never crossed the boundary. It always stopped just before, as if both were afraid of what would happen if it didn't. For Whitney, that fear was deeper than romance. As a black woman raised in a world steeped in gospel, where faith demanded self-denial and identity was policed through shame, even the idea of trusting someone like Kelly, white, privileged, and protected, felt like risking everything. And when Kelly chose to keep things in the gray, neither acknowledging nor shielding Whitney, it felt like a silent betrayal. Whitney was left in the shadows. Again, many called Whitney overly sensitive. But when the world asks you to erase yourself daily, even a small kindness, a glance that lingers, a hand that doesn't recoil, can feel like salvation. And when that salvation is withdrawn, it doesn't explode. It seeps in, slowly, painfully. Whitney never wrote a song that pointed to Kelly, but on her 2001 tour, amid a sea of greatest hits, she chose unexpectedly to sing "Didn't We Almost Have It All?" Her voice that night was different, haunting, raw. The room fell silent, and when the final note faded, she added quietly, "That's for the ones who chose silence over honesty." Some people come into your life not to be loved, but to make you feel foolish for ever thinking you could. Then came Rosie. Not a dramatic fallout, not hatred, but a simmering hurt. Whitney once believed she had found safety in what they called friendship, but later, she felt reduced just another name and a punchline. Rosie O'Donnell never hid her life. She joked about it, owned it, even laughed through what others found sacred. And it worked for her. It made her famous. But for Whitney, lived her truths in fear, not freedom. It felt like a mockery. Rosie, loud and self-assured, represented everything Whitney couldn't afford to be. And in the late 90s, when Whitney's personal life teetered at the edge, Rosie had become her comfort. Someone who made her laugh, made her feel like a person again, not a headline. But when sincerity was met with satire, Whitney walked away not out of anger, but out of quiet heartbreak. Because to her, intimacy wasn't entertainment, it was sacred. They laughed, they texted late at night, they met after shows. But one night, everything changed. It happened after a charity event. Whitney finished performing late, and Rosie offered to drive her home. They sat in the car for over 2 hours. No one knows what was said, but after that, Whitney never appeared on Rosie's show again. No statement, no explanation, just absence. Rumors followed. An anonymous source from the TV industry claimed Rosie had shared a private story about Whitney backstage, drawing laughter from a few. Whitney heard about it not from Rosie but secondhand. She wasn't angry, just quiet. And then she said, I trusted her with that. Whatever friendship they had, whatever fragile trust existed, dissolved. Not through betrayal, but through carelessness. For Whitney, Rosie was the first person she'd let in without a filter. Unlike Jody, who kept her distance, or Latifah, who stayed guarded, Rosie felt familiar. Someone who would sit by your sickbed and make you laugh. Whitney mistook that comfort for understanding. But Rosie made people laugh for a living, even if it meant slicing into sacred places. Years later, she said in an interview, some people are made to be storms in your life, not shelters. Many believed she was speaking about Whitney, and Whitney, she had already known. A friend once overheard her say, with tired honesty, she thought I was a show, but I'm a person. That's why Rosie held the fourth place on Whitney's quiet list, not because of unrequited love, but because of a love for friendship that wasn't returned with care. Intimacy without respect, Whitney once said, is just another kind of betrayal. Softer, but it lasts longer. She once joked, some women don't walk into your life. They crash through like a damn chandelier. People laughed, but her voice didn't. Her assistant later said she meant Angelina. No images, no video, just whispered memories, veiled references, and a silence that lasted over a decade. If there was a story between Whitney and Angelina Jolie, it was the one that lingered longest in the dark. It started quietly in the mid-2000s. Whitney was emerging from chaos, still radiant, still weary. Angelina was at her peak, enigmatic, untouchable, the center of the world's gaze. They met at a private fundraiser in Beverly Hills. A witness recalled, Whitney didn't blink when she saw Jolie, and Jolie looked back longer than she needed to. What followed were private meetings, not dates, not affairs, but conversations filled with something unnamed. A stylist later recalled Whitney saying, that girl is wild in the most dangerous way. I like it too much. Then she went quiet. One unofficial account said they spent an evening together at a secluded villa in Laurel Canyon. After that, the connection disappeared, gone without a trace. A media insider said it best. Whitney knew this wasn't sustainable. Jolie makes you feel like you matter, then moves on. That's what hurt Whitney the most. Not abandonment, but feeling like just another page in someone else's story. For Whitney, it had been rare. She felt unburdened. Seen, no stage, no performance. Just herself. And then it ended. She made me feel real. That's why I hated her. After line scribbled in Whitney's personal journal, found years later in her Atlanta home. The subject was Angelina Jolie. Angelina never confirmed anything. In an interview with Elle, when asked about love and gender, she replied, I've loved people regardless of gender. Energy matters more. It was vague enough to admire, but for those left behind it felt like erasure. Whitney didn't need a grand declaration, but she couldn't bear being treated like a passing moment. According to someone close, Angelina was the only person who made Whitney feel like just a detail in someone else's unnamed story. Whitney once said, Jolie's life is a hurricane. You don't walk with hurricanes, you get blown away. Insiders often remarked, Angelina had an uncanny magnetism, especially for those who were hurting. She didn't heal them, she didn't promise forever, but she saw them for a moment, and sometimes, a moment is all it takes to unravel someone who loves with her whole heart. Whitney didn't know how to love halfway. She didn't understand affection without commitment, and when she realized that, to Jolie, it had never been real, only temporary. She didn't mourn. She grew furious. Not at Angelina, at herself for hoping. Then came Tessa. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a headline. Just a girl from the New York underground poetry bars, free jazz basements, places where people went to vanish into ambiguity. Whitney, still famous and fragile, met her during a moment of emotional unraveling. Someone from the art world remembered, the way Tessa spoke made Whitney feel like listening to a jazz solo, unpredictable, but impossible to turn away from. They shared long phone calls about Sarah Vaughan, strolled empty parks after midnight, shared silence the way some share kisses. Whitney once called her, a jazz note I could never place on the sheet. But that was the problem. Whitney couldn't bear ambiguity. She lived by instinct but needed clarity. Tessa, on the other hand, was ambiguity. Fluid, unlabeled, unbought. In a 2018 interview, Tessa said, I'm attracted to people, not genders. I don't feel the need to shout it, but I also don't hide it. It sounded gentle, but to Whitney, it was a quiet dismissal. She didn't need to be shouted about, but she needed to know she was real. The breaking point came when Tessa declined to attend a charity event Whitney had organized. No call, just a message. I think you need the space. I can't be that person right now. After that, they never spoke again. A producer who worked with Whitney around that time remembered. She hated vagueness more than lies. To her, love was yes or no, never maybe. In a session not long after, Whitney altered the lyrics of an old classic. She sang, "Don't jazz me up if you're just passing through." No one asked, everyone knew. As Tessa's fame rose, especially through her unconventional film roles, rumors resurfaced. People recalled Whitney's old line, "She's an unpredictable jazz note." They didn't know if it was true, but they didn't need to. Anyone who saw the way Whitney looked at her knew it had its own rhythm, a rhythm of hurt that never found release. The timeline between them was never clear, but the emotion was undeniable, like an indie film that never made it past editing. No clear plot, no credits, but unforgettable. Because in a world built on artifice, it's not clarity that makes us believe, it's ambiguity, especially when it exposes the parts of us we're most desperate to hide. The irony is, among the 7 who caused Whitney heartache, Tessa wasn't blamed like the others, but she may have left the deepest wound, not through betrayal, but through ambiguity. For someone like Whitney, who could stand before thousands and still feel entirely alone, the greatest pain wasn't being left, it was never knowing if she was ever truly chosen. They loved each other like people who were never allowed to grand declarations. No wedding photos, no framed embrace hung on a wall. Just glances that lingered a second too long. Just hands resting on shoulders no one dared to hold for real. But Robin Crawford, she was different. She wasn't a rumor, she wasn't a spark. She was a life lived beside Whitney, the one who didn't need to be named because they both already knew. And that's the tragedy, because the person Whitney loved most was the one she could never hold in the light. Robin wrote, "We were everything to each other. We didn't need the world to know because we knew. But the world wouldn't allow them that kind of peace." In a culture where love between 2 black women was either erased or stepping into the spotlight was never an option. Fame came with a price. And for Whitney, that price was silence. Even after they were no longer romantic. Robin stayed backstage, in the studio near the edges of every storm. She didn't need to be seen, she just was. A former colleague once said, "That wasn't the look of a friend. That was the look of someone who still loved." And perhaps that's what makes Robin's place on the list most painful. Because she didn't hurt Whitney, she didn't betray her, she simply had to be put away, quietly, tenderly, for the sake of a career, for the comfort of a public, for a world not yet ready. Robin once wrote a line that silenced everyone who read it. Whitney knew how to love. She was just taught to hide it. In another life, maybe they would have walked red carpets hand in hand, laughed in interviews, grown old together, argued over morning coffee, and left dishes in the sink. But that wasn't their world. So Robin stayed in the wings, and Whitney learned to live with demonstrating love for legacy. When Whitney passed, many spoke, some told stories, others hinted at truths. Only one person stayed silent, only Robin. The only one who didn't need to explain, the only one who never called her anything but Whitney, the only one who loved her like a sad song with no chorus, quiet, unfinished, and real. Whitney Houston wasn't just a legendary voice, she was a mirror to a generation drenched in fame but bound by unspoken rules. Each of these 7 women, whether famous or barely whispered about, represented pieces of a life she was never fully allowed to claim. Her love wasn't lacking, it simply wasn't permitted to be seen. From Robin, the soul she was never allowed to name, to Angelina, Latifah, Jody, and Tessa, became a pause in the unfinished melody that was Whitney's life. We may never know the entire truth, but we feel it in her silences, in her songs, and in the ache of a woman who could sing about love but was never truly allowed to live in it. If this story touched you, let it echo. Like the video, leave a comment below. Tell us which part stayed with you the longest. And if you want more deep dives into the untold emotional truths of icons like Whitney, subscribe and join us on this journey through the unseen. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.